here in the Sermon Brainwave for the 2020/2021 Advent to Epiphany series. And today we're looking at Advent 3, the third Sunday of Advent, which this year is going to be on the 13th of December 2020. And I'm here with the Reverend Gavin Locke, St. James Presbyterian Church in Bedford View, and the Reverend Dr. Peter Langerman of Durbanville Presbyterian Church, who's also at the moment the serving moderator of the General Assembly. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you, George.
So we're talking about Advent 3, and I'm not going to ask you what does your church do in Advent, because I've asked that 3 times before on the different Sundays of Advent. But let me ask a more general question about the season, if there's anything you'd like to share about the season, and then very specifically, Advent 3. Is it the John the Baptist Sunday? Is there another theme that's traditionally attached to it, no matter how the lectionary changes? How do you see it? Gavin, you want to go first?
George, yes. Advent 3 is interesting in that it's known as Gaudete Sunday, which really is put there as a gap for penitence. So Advent is usually a time of penitence, of self-reflection, and this is almost the breather in the middle, where the theme is joy, which we'll hear more about when Peter talks about his sermon. And why it works so well for us at St. James is we usually use Advent 3 to have our carol service. So we get the whole congregation outside, we sing carols, and it's really quite a joyful occasion. And of course, it usually lines up with the long weekend of December the 16th. And so really for us, the day has come to symbolize joy and celebration and just sort of letting your hair down, so to speak. So for us, that's really what has come to represent. In keeping with the pink candle that we usually put out then, it's just a time of joy and celebration.
Excellent. Peter?
Yeah, I am, as I mentioned before, George, on one of our other segments, we do candles. We also do a carols by candlelight service in the church, which we proceed with a picnic outside in the garden. Usually the 4th Sunday in Advent, though. So, so nothing specific around the 3rd Sunday in Advent, but that's really kind of Advent for us. Let me say something about. Also, I'll talk a little bit later about why I chose this particular portion. Is because this will be my 14th year in this congregation. And when you follow the lectionaries through the seasons like Advent, you sometimes look for a different angle on the seasons. It's you don't want to always cover the same ground. And I thought it would be an interesting exercise to look at the psalm. I don't normally preach on the psalms, but I thought this would be a nice break, both for myself and for the congregation. To get off a sort of well-worn path onto what you called earlier the road less traveled.
So you've been through the 3-year lectionary at least 4 times, and you're starting your 5th.
Exactly. So you start inadvertently repeating yourself. It's difficult sometimes to find a fresh way of saying something, which is where I found the psalm quite helpful. Yes.
Barbara Brown Taylor once said that when she preached through the 3-year lectionary, I think 3 or 4 times, she took out the files and burnt them in a public display. She wanted to get rid of every sermon she'd ever preached. And I said to her, because she said it personally to me, I said to her, that's fine and well when all your sermons are published. But for the rest of us that don't get to publish them, we don't have the privilege of burning anything. Anyway, okay, let's talk about this road less traveled. And before you speak about how you would preach it, let's just have a general conversation on Psalm 126. And those that are listening to this video clip will know this psalm. It's a very familiar psalm. It's one of the series of the Psalms of Ascent that Israel used to sing as they proceeded from their homes up to Jerusalem for the times of festival. And it goes like this: when the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those, or men, who dreamed. Our mouths were filled with laughter, our tongues with songs of joy. Then it was said among the nations, the Lord has done great things for them. The Lord has done great things for us, and we are filled with joy. Restore our fortunes, O Lord, like streams in the Negev. Those who sow in tears will reap with songs of joy. Those who go out weeping, carrying seed to sow, will return with songs of joy, carrying sheaves with them. Any general remarks about that psalm? Anything that you find interesting?
Well,
I love the history.
Okay, Peter, you
Gavin.
got this, and then Gavin.
Okay.
Yeah, carry on, Peter.
Thanks, Gav. It's interesting. The psalm is in two distinct parts. It is definitely in two halves, and the two halves are quite different. In the first half, there's this great sense of anticipation, lots of laughter and joy. In the second half, there is joy, but there's also weeping. This psalm, often reminds me of our journey in this country out of post-apartheid South Africa. You know, when we came, when we first, when Nelson Mandela was released, and then all that went with that, and then the first elections and so on. It was like the first part of the psalm. You know, we were filled with laughter, with a great sense of anticipation. The Lord has done great things for us. We were filled with joy. Then we began to realize there's actually quite a lot of work to be done. It's not the nirvana that we all thought it was going to be, and it's going to create, you know, there's a lot of work. And that's really like the second part of the psalm. I think is the experience of the people after exile. They come back from exile full of excitement, and then see how much work there is to be done. And although there is joy, obviously, in the second part, there's also the sense of much work, you know, to be done. There is weeping as well as joy.
Yes.
And you know, an application to our current situation is having come out of lockdown. You know, there's a great sense of having moved from lockdown into something now a bit more free. But now we're beginning to realize the immense toll that lockdown has taken on people, on families, on the economy, you know, on jobs. So we now realize that there's so much to be done post. So for me, this psalm speaks directly into our experience, both our lived experience in this country and our current experience, you know, of the COVID situation.
Good. Gavin?
My thoughts are very similar to Peter's in that, you know, in terms of the history of the psalm, I think the people of Israel had put all their hope in the end of the exile, in returning back to Jerusalem and rebuilding. And I think we do the same thing ourselves nowadays, where we say, if only, you know, if only the lockdown came to an end, or if only we came out of exile, if only we could rebuild. And there's almost the sense of single solution hope in our lives, where everything that we do, we rest our hope for, shall we say, a prosperous, a full future, resting on one thing. And of course, the disappointment when you get what you hope for and discover that it's not exactly the dream that you were anticipating. And exactly as Peter said, you know, the people of Israel came out of Babylon, went back to Jerusalem, and when the rebuilding had to start, that's where they realized that it wasn't the dream that they'd hoped for. Yes. And I think it's a very subtle reminder that our hope should rest in God, which of course Peter talks about later on in his sermon itself. And the wonderful illustration of sowing at the end of the psalm is a reminder that while we must put the work in, we must sow the seeds, it is only really God, and this is such a cliche, that can make the seeds grow. And that's where our if only should really rest, is in God, and not in necessarily the end of exile or this or that. Yes. And so similar to what Peter said, that's what's quite profound for me from the psalm.
Yeah, I want to agree with both of you and say that I think that the psalm is probably designed to be aspirational and then invitational, or aspirational and then you know, asking God to fulfill what we believe His promises are. So the people of Israel, as you say, coming back from exile, believed that that was the fulfillment of what God wanted. You know, God wanted to restore them, and so they demonstrate by celebrating that. You know, and even the nations around them are surprised at how gracious God has been in restoring them. So they are saying it, and we are confirming it. He has indeed been good for us. But then at the same time, as both of you have mentioned, they are fully aware that dependence on God is the only way in which their dreams will be realized. You know, they learned it in the desert as they moved out of in the Exodus, as they moved out of Egypt towards the Promised Land. They were taught that lesson over and over again. And now, when they stand there next to the broken walls of Jerusalem, they realize yet again they have to be dependent on God because they have nothing. You know, the Negev is a wilderness, but when the stream comes, then there are those little shoots and the grasses and flowers and things that come out. So, and I've mentioned it in another one of these sermon brainwaves, but I remember such a beautiful occurrence when we were in the Qumran caves. And looking down, and people had started to gather by the road, and we were wondering what on earth were they doing. And of course, we were expecting the worst, it's terrorism or something. And the guide said, no, just relax and watch. And we relaxed and watched, only to discover that the people were gathering to watch the waters flow down from the heights, you know, and these desolate, dry riverbeds were now being filled up with the rain from further, you know, to the west. And so that is the goodness of God, you know, that is God restoring the fortunes and making the plants grow. Anyway, okay, that's a beautiful psalm. It's a psalm of ascent, and it's a psalm of joy, because this, as you mentioned earlier, is the Sunday that we concentrate on the joy in the Christmas story. Peter, how would you preach it?
Okay, so as I said, I don't often preach the Psalms because my preaching style tends to be expository, quite analytical, you know, with application and so on. And the Psalms you've got to treat the Psalms differently to that.
Yes.
You know, you can exposit the Psalms, of course, and you should, but, you know, you said in your introduction to this series of ours, George, that beautiful quote by Friedrich Buechner, about a sermon is more like a poem or a love letter, you know, where you draw into yourself. And I think that's nowhere more so for me than when you preach from the Psalms.
Right.
Because the Psalms are not carefully considered theological treatises on, you know, on great themes. They're the response of faithful people to real lived situations. So it's how the people of faith respond to various situations. And so I suppose there should always be a kind of cautionary note when preaching, you know, from the Psalms. But by the same token, there's a kind of a freedom that comes with that as well to kind of do something different. And that's partly why I chose the Psalm. I would, when I preach, if I would preach on the Psalm, or as I preach on the Psalm, I would make try and draw the distinction between being a pilgrim and a tourist. And there's a third distinction that I didn't actually put in the notes that struck me afterwards, and a crusader. Now, the similarities between tourists, pilgrims, and crusaders is they all travel to different countries. They all undertake a journey. But the purpose for the journey is very different. You know, a tourist, when you go as a tourist to a different place, you go to take photographs and see the sights and, you know, go from one place to another. When you go as a crusader, you go to conquer, you know, to take over. But when you go as a pilgrim, you go to learn and to be shaped and to be formed. So I would draw that, you know, that distinction. And for many of our people, they would know the experience of what it is to go as a tourist to a new place, but might not think about a pilgrimage. For my wife Sally and I, we walked the Camino 3 years ago as a pilgrimage. And a pilgrimage is a very different experience of seeing a place. You know, for a pilgrim, it's all about the journey. It's all about walking that road. And as the pilgrims come towards Jerusalem, as they would on the great feast days, They undertook a journey that they'd done many times before. So this journey wasn't new for them in the sense that this is something they repeated year by year. But they sing these wonderful songs, the songs that remind them of the fact that they're on a journey, that they're going to Jerusalem. And as they sing these songs, as they repeat the stories, as they run through these worship experiences, they are reminded of the goodness of God and how God is with them. And then the second thing I would talk about really comes from that, the difference between leaving monuments versus footprints. It's our tendency as people to build monuments to the great events of the past. And we tend to do this in spiritual terms as well. We tend to kind of mark the great events of our lives and erect monuments to them. But there's that beautiful quote which I've quoted by William Faulkner when he says, not monuments, but talking about the Psalms, not monuments, but footprints. Monument only says, at least I got this far, while the footprint says, this is where I was when I moved again. And that this is the challenge for us, is to realize that God is always kind of moving us on. That while we give thanks for what has been, as I've preached many times in the congregation that I've served, the best always lies ahead for us. God always has better things in store for us. We have to keep that in mind, no matter what age we are or where we are in our life journey. As soon as you start thinking that the best is behind you and you've seen the best in your life, you start to die, in a sense. So the challenge is always to remember that the best is yet to come, and to walk those paths with God. And out of that experience comes joy. Joy for the Christian is not only not being happy all the time, but it's being knowing that God is with you, knowing that God is provided, that it comes from abundance, from vitality, from knowing that God is with us. When I wrote this particular thing, my mom had just passed away. In fact, I was a bit late in my submission because of the death of my mom, and I found it quite therapeutic, actually, being able to spend a bit of time in the psalm and think about joy in the midst of sorrow and pain, because it sounds incongruous slightly, but that is our experience. Joy isn't something that comes from being happy all the time or having things go our way. We do experience moments when, we all experience those moments, when life doesn't quite turn out the way we expected, yet we know that God is with us. We decide to live in response to the abundance and the grace and the love and the mercy of God. And we are, as the psalmist says in verse 3, we are one happy people, happy and blessed. So those are some thoughts for me around this particular song.
Okay, and so I'm guessing that when you talk about the difference between a pilgrim and a tourist, you're going to encourage those who are meeting together on that third Sunday in Advent, that what we have done since the beginning of Advent and what we continue to do until Christmas is we're on a pilgrimage. And we're on a pilgrimage toward this event, which reminds us of God's love for us in Christ and his transformation of the world. And that they should leave footprints and know that moving forward is the way to go. Interesting, when you spoke about monuments, my thoughts went back to the building of the temple in the time of David, and the absolute base desire of human beings to build something, to make a monument. Whether you go back to Babel itself, and also David looking around at the Canaanites and their high places, and looking around at the nations around him and seeing the magnificent temples by those standards of those years. Of course, nothing near the Greek and the Roman temples, but the ancient Near East was filled with temples of one kind or another, or shrines to the gods, and David feeling absolutely embarrassed that God didn't have a fixed abode and so really trying to strong arm God. And there's that fascinating dialogue where God says, but well, firstly, I brought you from the sheep pen. You need to understand here. So when you want to build something, just realize who you are. You may not be the right person for the job. But secondly, have I ever asked for anything like that? Did I ever ask for a monument? Did I ever? Well, was I not content to dwell in tents? And you get this picture of the God who dwells in tents. And so monuments are really not on his agenda. But because he's gracious, he kind of he gives in and he says, okay, well then do it. And then here's some things that you need to take into account. Solomon must do the building, blah, 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 and there's some regulations. But these monuments are not really God's agenda. And yet we have this base desire to create them, not so?
Very good. Yeah, I think, drawing the distinction, to encourage people, what you talked about earlier, in the journey of Advent, to undertake that journey as a pilgrim, not as a tourist or as a crusader. In other words, to savor the journey, not to just look at the sights and take some pictures
Yes.
and move on, or just look to kind of conquer the season. I've just got to we hold on like grim death, especially those of us who have young children. It can be a bit of a nightmare season for young families, but to actually encourage people to experience the journey, and to live the journey, and then talking about monuments and foot statues, and should they remain, should they go, and that's a very current debate. Versus special times in our own life when we family events and spending time with others, taking photographs and so on. The difference between those monuments, those statues that we build to commemorate the past, versus the memories that we build with others.
Yes.
To expand on that a little bit, I think when we build monuments, we often build and I think we do that spiritually as well, as I think, George, you alluded to earlier, where we tend to rest our coats on hooks of moments of great importance, perhaps when we came of faith, perhaps confirmation, profound moments. And the temptation there is to leave us static in our journey of faith. And as Peter alludes to, the idea of pilgrimage is one of journeying together. I mean, we all know these songs of ascent were sung by all the males who had to go through up to Jerusalem for the compulsory feasts. And there's just a great sense of camaraderie as they sort of move together towards worship in the temple. But there really is a sense of movement, that our faith is something, I mean, as we often hear, that is always reforming, that is always growing and changing. And the temptation is for us to rest on our laurels, on these moments of profundity, without understanding that every day faith demands that there's a fluidity about it the whole time. And that was one thing that came through in Peter's sermon that was quite profound for me, was this idea of pilgrimage is one of always moving forward, of not just saying, okay, we've arrived, which of course you've alluded to already.
Okay. Gavin, why don't you continue a little bit? If there's any other remarks you'd like to make. I know you responded to Peter's original thing. Anything else that you would add if you were preaching the sermon or talk about?
Well, I love the subtle humor that comes through in Scripture that I think we so often miss. And in this particular psalm, it's to be found in the Hebrew. And you remember the opening line about dreaming, and how dreaming means to enlarge or fatten, which is quite intriguing because I'm on diet at the moment. And then later on, where it talks about how God has done great things for us, which literally translated is how God has enlarged for us. So there's really the sense of abundance, of prosperity, of having access to resources, and then contrasted with the second aspect of the psalm, which talks about the dryness of the Negev and the absence of water. And there's this dramatic, almost humorous two poles of abundance and fatness and enlarging with a sense of desperate dryness. And the solution is to be found in the sowing
Yes.
of the seeds. And right at the end of the psalm, it speaks of sowing with tears. Now, there was an ancient tradition in the pagan beliefs that if you sowed a seed while you were wailing or crying out aloud, that somehow the seeds would be more prosperous and produce a better harvest. And this juxtaposition of fatness versus dryness,
Yes.
barrenness, being resolved with the sowing of the seeds, really, if one wants to push the analogy a little bit, that our tears and our lamenting, this is a psalm of lament, God takes those laments and those tears, and almost what Peter was alluding to with his mom, and God is the one who turns them into fatness. So he takes our pain, our suffering, our disappointment, and if we're willing to put the work in, to sow the seeds, to put the graft in, then our tears, our mourning, will produce a harvest far beyond our imagination. And so it just it appealed to me, the subtle humor, the vividness of the illustrations of abundance versus dryness, which would have been very real, as you alluded to, George, watching the water run down from
Yes.
the caves at Qumran, and how that results into something that can really be beautiful and abundant coming out of this disappointment.
That's lovely. It really is a lovely image. And can I also say that I wondered when I read the psalm in the context of the Babylonian captivity, and also in the context of the incarnation, I wondered whether it wouldn't be better for us to try to understand our future, our destiny, from God's perspective rather than our own. Let me explain. So when the people were released from their, well, not really captivity, but their relocation into, Persia and so on, and they made their way back to Jerusalem and surrounds, why did they think God was, if they thought it was God that released them, what was the purpose of that release? Well, I think the purpose was to be a light unto the nations, which has always been the purpose, from the time of the Abrahamic covenant. But I think the prevailing view, or certainly the way in which we understand the prevailing view, is that it was, so that they could be the people of God again, chosen by Him and so on. And it's the same with and therein lies the problem, because the abundance comes when we are in the will of God and when we are moving towards, kingdom principles. Now, it's the same problem with the incarnation. What is the purpose of Jesus coming? Well, it's not so that some of us can feel safe that we're among the sheep and the others are among the goats. No, it's for us to be a light unto the nations. So we are saved in order to participate in this salvific work of God. And out of that will come abundance, not just out of the fact that we feel safe. So I think it's important to draw that out as well when we preach it in the season of Advent. It's to challenge ourselves as the preachers and the congregation who are there, that we are saved for a purpose. We feel this joy when we are in the will of God, and the will of God is for the whole world to be reconciled under Christ. Not so.
Yeah. I think for us, George, serving churches that have been in existence for a number of years, this is the constant challenge. The fact that we tend to become we kind of long for the good old days, or we look back to where the church was in a different place, where maybe there were more members, or great projects were happening, or whatever. There's a tendency in us as humans to sanitize almost the past. This is a natural human tendency, and And as you say, that's when we do that, we forget that there is a future. That that there is something ahead for us. That
Yes.
As of God wants to take us into something new. I was thinking about lockdown and so on. That actually lockdown has forced us into new patterns that we've been challenged about for a long time, but just haven't implemented because we were lazy or just complacent. But lockdown forced us to devise new ways of doing church. It's forced us to begin to think more mission, in a more missional paradigm.
Yes.
And that is it kind of ties in, I think, with what you're saying. It's not that God wills these things to happen, but that in the midst of these crises and so on, we are able to discover things, and God is able to teach us things that we never knew before.
Yes, right. Okay, well, let's talk about a possible second reading. If you want to use 2 readings for the day, you might choose to read first chapter of John, but it's basically confined to introducing John the Baptist. There was a man who was sent from God. His name was John. And then verse 19 again, which talks about John the Baptist's ministry. Now, this was John's testimony. So it's all John, John, and John. You could use that one, or you could use the piece of Isaiah 61, which is suggested for the day. And this contains that well-known piece that Jesus read in the synagogue. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. And so it goes down, and exchanging, interestingly, the crown of glory instead of ashes, oil of joy instead of mourning, garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. They will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord, for the display of his splendor. So it's the turning of the lot is the second part of that. But it comes after a strong prophetic message, which is also turning of a lot. But the turning of the lot here is much more provocative, because it's not the rich, who then receive the good news like as usual. It's now the poor and the brokenhearted, are going to be bound up, and the captives are going to be set free. What do you think of that Isaiah 61 as an alternative reading, or as a second reading?
I find it interesting in the parallels in terms of the psalm that we've just read, and I mean, I don't think that's coincidence. I think the readings are chosen because they parallel each other. Jesus's proclamation, the word liberties, is reminiscent of the Jubilee year, which you may remember in the Hebrew Bible and Leviticus in particular, where every 7 years there was a relief from debt and things like that. And after every 7 times 7 years, in the 50th year, there was a time when the Jews were not supposed to plant harvests, where debt was relieved and captives were set free, particularly those who were enslaved because they owed money. And there's an author called Roland DeVoe who asserts that there is no record in history of the Jubilee year ever being celebrated, the 50th year, because the requirements were just almost like lockdown. They were impossible to achieve. And where that comes into this text from Isaiah, and similarly with the Psalm, and pretty much like Jesus, is the first section of Isaiah in the reading. It's really about a messenger who's speaking, and speaking about a restoration of the landscape, in contrast with the Psalm, which speaks about barrenness. And then the second part of the reading of Isaiah talks about actually engaging in action, making that abundance happen. And like the Psalm, where you have to sow, but similarly to Jesus's life, where part of his life was very much about proclaiming the good news, the message, the teaching, but then that was always accompanied by action. He went out and showed what it meant to embrace the marginalized, to show grace to those who were condemned and judged. And so both the text from the Psalms and this text from Isaiah speaks of the hope, and yet also how we need to put that hope into action, which of course is epitomized by Jesus' proclamation in Luke 4, where he declares that he's come to give sight to the blind, because that's what he did. He went out and did it. And so I find this passage from Isaiah and the Psalm challenges for us to not only speak of the hope, but to go and be the hope by how we live our lives. And in some way, to echo what you were saying a moment ago, George, that to understand that the harvest that is produced is not a harvest for ourselves, but one for the world out there. And that is how we become a house of prayer for all nations.
Peter?
Yeah, I think Gavin's absolutely right. I think the notes that are sounded, the chords that are played in this passage are very similar to what you hear in the psalm, and obviously that isn't by chance. It's designed way. I've always wondered, by the way, when Jesus read this, that we're told about in Luke 4, whether this was the designated portion for the day or whether he went and actually found it. And I think it's probably was the designated, it was the lectionary reading for that particular day. And Jesus, applies it to himself, and that, causes a backlash. But it is a song that hits very similar notes, the notes of rebuilding and recreating, and the notes of promise, the notes of a future, that there is a future for the people of God, and I think those are notes that we can sound, in this. Well, when you talk about a post-lockdown time, in the midst of COVID, in the midst of great uncertainty, in the midst of the disruption to people's lives because of disruptions to the economy and so on, we can make similar. We can echo those the tones that occur in the psalm and in this passage from Isaiah for people.
Yes.
Christian hope is not just the vague belief that everything will sort of work out fine in the end. It's that God is with us in the midst of this journey, and God is traveling alongside us, and God is the one who will bring us through.
Yes.
And that ultimately God will undertake for us. And I think that's something well worth emphasizing in a time of great uncertainty.
Yeah, I don't want to prolong the discussion too much, because I think basically what the two of you have said really is what I had in mind when I looked at the connection between Psalm 126 and Isaiah 61. But I want to emphasize something that Peter said earlier, which I think is very, very important. When we look back at the past, we often sanitize the past. And I don't only think sanitize, but I would add the word caricature. So we take something that we remember, and the past is all like that, which of course is not true. It's much more complex. And in the same way, I think the message of the gospel is caricatured. It's simplified to such a level that the complexity that it brings, is sort of fobbed away. And I think Isaiah 61 helps us to appreciate the complexity of the gospel message. It is good news for the poor. It is freedom for the captives, etc. And sure, at one level it is, in the angel's words, good news, a glad tidings, great joy for all the people. But in another way, some people are going to get hurt in this process, because they stand in the way of the breaking in of the gracious kingdom of God, and that's by their choice, and there will be inevitable consequences. But it's a beautiful piece. I want to add a couple of things about joy, because I think joy is in all of these texts, even in John 1, although it's not as clear as these other two. Catherine Marshall had a beautiful quote in which she said, "The Gospels record Jesus as breaking up every funeral he ever attended. He who knew no sin had a personality overflowing with gladness." I love that quote. And then the second one, Leander Keck wrote, he says, "I do not know why so much of mainline Protestantism has become a joyless religion. Perhaps we are more impressed by the problems of the world than by the power of God. Perhaps we have become so secular that we indeed think that now everything depends on us. That surely ought to make us depressed. Perhaps we have simply gotten bored with a boring God whom we have substituted for the God of the Bible. We sometimes sing the doxology as if it were a dirge. Even communion or the Eucharist, despite the words of the great thanksgiving, is really the thankful, joyous foretaste of the great banquet, the one who triumphed over death. But mostly a mournful occasion for introspection. A joyless Christianity is a clear sign that something is amiss in a dirty church. Fascinating, provocative remark. But this joy that should permeate everything. And then there's a lovely one, which I'm not going to read, by Henry Nouwen, talking about a friend of his who just radiated joy, constantly radiated joy. And as Peter said earlier, it wasn't affected by the circumstance of life. It was just there, and it wasn't silly. It was profound. But then I think we can't preach a sermon on joy without remembering C.S. Lewis's peculiar line, joy is the serious business of heaven. So it almost turns our metaphors on their heads, because we thought serious was not joyful, and we thought joyful was not serious, and yet it is, and it's the language of heaven. It's what we will speak to one another. It's the currency, and I think that's really beautiful. And then the last one was Fanny Crosby, the hymn writer who was blind, and when she was 8 years old, blind as she was, she wrote this. Imagine being blind in her era, by the way. I mean, what kind of facilities did they have? And she says, "Oh, what a happy child I am, though I cannot see. I am resolved that in this world contented I will be. How many blessings I enjoy that other people don't. To weep and sigh because I'm blind, I cannot and I won't." Powerful words. So joy, I think,
often
permeates. Gav, sorry, carry on.
So I often think that for us, joy, because it's so elusive to us, because it seems to be this super spiritual attainment, and I guess one almost feels reminiscent of the search when meditating, where you've got to go through the different levels, and only those who obtain a certain level of spirituality get to experience the joy. But for me, in terms of our faith, joy is a much more practical thing. And just to cite a couple of examples from our texts, the psalmist alludes to the fact, well, God has blessed you before. You were like men who dreamed, and God can do that for you again. It's a great source of joy, that kind of hope that it brings. This text from is difficult. The Lord loved justice. For I, the Lord, love justice. I hate robbery and wrongdoing. And, people often say that, I can't be at peace when the world isn't at peace, or when there's injustice in the world. And the fact that our faith drives us to work against injustice makes room for joy, because we know we're doing something about it. The fact that our faith is so abundant in grace encourages joy, because there's an absence of condemnation. So in a roundabout way, what I'm trying to say is that because it's one of dealing with the issues, because it's one of grappling with the laments of the world, we're almost free to embrace joy, because we're not just sitting back watching the suffering. And we almost have permission to celebrate and rejoice, because we're doing something about the lousy things in life, and we're obviously trying to live as Christ in the world. So as much as it is a spiritual gift, as much as it's a gift from Jesus, it's because we do the hard work that we are free to be a people of joy. So sorry, that's just an aside to what you were saying.
No, lovely. Peter, any last remarks?
I think, George, and I think it flows from what Gavin's just said about joy. We seldom understand joy in our current world, so we think it's achieved through pleasure. So we in order to manufacture joy, we try to do things that are pleasurable for us, things we enjoy. We try and eliminate hurt, get rid of pain, get rid of insecurity, get rid of disappointment. Lighten the boredom of life, and we think that these things will bring us joy. But that's not the picture that the psalm paints for us. Laughter is a result of living amid the works of God. And what is the greatest work of God? It's the incarnation. So the incarnation should bring us immense joy, and revitalize, I think, sense of God's presence with us in the midst of our sin and brokenness and pain and disappointment and all of that. God still comes to us and doesn't give up on us, doesn't abandon us, but continues to provide for us and to walk alongside us and weep with us, and laugh with us, bring us to a place of laughter.
Great. Well, thank you, friends, for the interesting discussion on the passages for the third Sunday in Advent. And I'd like to end our conversation with this prayer that Rod Bottas has written for this particular Sunday. So let's pray together. I delight greatly in the Lord. The Lord has done great things for us, and we are filled with joy. Be joyful always. Pray continually. Give thanks, for this is God's will for you. Holy Father, you created joy. Thank you for those moments when I did not have to tell myself, be joyful now. But I discovered that I was full of joy. I sang with songs I liked, some worship songs, some not. I smiled at someone I did not know and loved that they smiled back. I actually said aloud to myself, that feels good, as I felt the sun warm my face, my back. I felt so special when my dog came running to me and my child crawled into my lap and my spouse held me and hugged me. Joy arrived and it was wonderful. Thank you, Lord, that as I wait for you, or your return, or just for you to answer prayers, you have given me such an easy to follow program. Be joyful always. Give thanks and pray. Holy Father, on the days when I feel I am going down into a lake of sadness and worry, on the days I feel so alone, on the days I feel so ashamed because of my behavior or thoughts, please restore me to the joy of salvation. Let me again delight greatly in you. I pray all this through Christ my Lord. Amen. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, George.
George.
Yes.